Have you ever felt like no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, someone will always find a way to make you feel small? That crushing sensation when the people who are supposed to be your family treat your accomplishments like they're nothing more than a silly hobby? Well, let me tell you about the moment I finally stopped swallowing my words and said what I should have said years ago. It was a Tuesday evening, and we were all gathered around my in-laws' dining table for what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. The chandelier above us cast this warm, golden light across the mahogany table, making everything look picture-perfect, like one of those family scenes you see in magazines. But underneath that warm glow, my hands were trembling as I gripped my wine glass, my knuckles turning white, because I had just heard my father-in-law make yet another dismissive comment about my career. This time, though, something inside me snapped. You know that feeling when you've been holding your breath underwater for too long, and your lungs are screaming for air? That's exactly how I felt in that moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the polite dinner conversation happening around me. I could feel my face getting hot, that telltale flush creeping up my neck that always betrayed my emotions. My mother-in-law was serving her famous roast chicken, the one she always made for special occasions, and everyone was passing dishes around, laughing about something my brother-in-law had said, but I wasn't really there anymore. I was somewhere else entirely, trapped in this whirlwind of emotions that had been building up for 5 long years. 5 years of biting my tongue, 5 years of fake smiles and forced laughter, 5 years of pretending that their words didn't cut me like knives. I remember looking down at my plate, watching the gravy pool around the mashed potatoes, and thinking about all those other dinners, all those other gatherings where I had let their comments slide. Every single time I had convinced myself that it wasn't worth the confrontation, that I should be the bigger person, that maybe they didn't mean it the way it sounded. But they did mean it. They absolutely did. And I had known it all along, hadn't I? I had just been too afraid to admit it, too worried about causing problems in my marriage, too concerned about being labeled as the difficult daughter-in-law who couldn't take a joke. But this wasn't a joke. It had never been a joke. My career, my passion, my life's work was being reduced to something trivial, something unworthy of respect, and I had enabled that behavior by staying silent. I could feel my husband's leg pressed against mine under the table, and I knew without looking that he was aware of my distress. He always knew. But knowing and doing something about it were two very different things. And that was part of the problem, wasn't it? The silence I had maintained wasn't just my own. It was ours. It was this unspoken agreement that we would just let his parents be who they were, that we would nod and smile and change the subject, that we would preserve the peace at any cost. But what was that peace costing me? What was it doing to my sense of self-worth, my confidence, my mental health? I thought about all the times I had driven home from their house with tears streaming down my face, my husband apologizing but never really confronting them. I thought about the nights I couldn't sleep, replaying their words in my head, trying to find some way to make them not hurt so much. I thought about how I had started to doubt myself, started to wonder if maybe they were right, if maybe what I did wasn't really that important after all. And that's when I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person who has ever been made to feel less than because someone else didn't understand or value what they did. This was about standing up not just for myself, but for the principle that everyone's work, everyone's passion, everyone's contribution to the world deserves respect. My father-in-law had just finished telling some story about his golf game when he turned to me with that condescending smile I had come to know so well and said something that would change everything. But let me back up a little because you need to understand how we got here. You need to know the full story of how a simple family relationship turned into something that felt like a constant battle for my dignity and self-respect. It all started 6 years ago when I first met the family that would eventually become my in-laws, and from that very first encounter, I should have seen the warning signs that were flashing like neon lights in the darkness. I remember the exact moment I walked into their house for the first time, carrying a carefully selected bottle of wine and wearing an outfit I had changed 3 times before settling on something that said professional but approachable. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, had been building up this meeting for weeks, telling me how excited his parents were to meet me, how much they were going to love me. He squeezed my hand as we walked up the stone pathway to their front door, and I could feel my palms sweating despite the cool autumn air. The house was impressive, one of those colonial-style homes with white columns and perfectly manicured lawns that screamed old money and traditional values. I should have known right then that I might not fit into their vision of what their son's partner should be, but I was in love and optimistic and convinced that anyone would see how happy their son was with me. His mother answered the door, and I'll never forget the way her eyes traveled from my face down to my shoes and back up again, taking in every detail with the precision of a customs inspector. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, and when she hugged me, it was one of those stiff, perfunctory embraces where your bodies barely touch. She welcomed us in, and the smell of expensive candles and furniture polish filled the air, everything so pristine and perfect that I was almost afraid to walk on the cream-colored carpet. His father was in the living room, standing by the fireplace with a scotch in his hand, looking every bit the successful businessman with his tailored slacks and crisp button-down shirt. He shook my hand with a firm grip and immediately asked me what I did for a living, and I remember feeling this flutter of excitement, because I loved talking about my work. I was so proud of what I had built, so passionate about my career path, and I thought this was my chance to make a great first impression. I told him I was a content creator and digital marketing specialist, that I ran my own consulting business helping brands build their online presence, that I had worked with some really innovative companies to develop strategies that had genuinely transformed their reach. I watched his expression change as I spoke, watched the polite interest in his eyes fade into something that looked almost like amusement. He nodded slowly, took a sip of his scotch, and said something I would hear variations of for years to come. He said that sounded interesting, in that tone people use when they mean the exact opposite, and then he asked when I was planning to get a real job. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but nobody else was laughing. My boyfriend tried to jump in, tried to explain that what I did was indeed a real job, a very successful one at that, but his father waved him off and changed the subject to something about the stock market. I felt this cold sensation in my stomach, this realization that I had somehow already failed a test I didn't know I was taking. His mother brought out appetizers, these elaborate little canapes that probably took hours to prepare, and the conversation shifted to family updates and neighborhood gossip. But I couldn't shake that feeling, couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head. Throughout dinner, I noticed other little things, subtle jabs wrapped in concerned questions. His mother asked if my business was stable enough to support myself, implying that I must be struggling financially. His father mentioned that their neighbor's daughter had just made partner at a law firm, emphasizing the word partner like it was the gold standard of success. Every time I tried to explain what I actually did, how the digital landscape was changing, how content marketing was becoming one of the most crucial aspects of business strategy, I could see their eyes glazing over with disinterest. They smiled and nodded, but I could tell they had already categorized me in their minds as someone who played around on the internet for a living. My boyfriend, bless him, tried to defend me, tried to make them understand, but even he seemed frustrated by their inability or unwillingness to grasp the legitimacy of my career. That night, driving home, I told myself it was just a bad first impression, that they would come around once they got to know me better, once they saw how serious and successful I actually was. I told myself that older generations sometimes had trouble understanding new career paths, that it wasn't personal. But deep down, I think I already knew the truth. This wasn't about understanding or generational differences. This was about their values, their expectations, their vision of what kind of person their son should be with, and I didn't fit that mold. Over the following months, as my relationship with their son grew more serious, the encounters with his parents became more frequent and, unfortunately, more painful. Every family gathering became another opportunity for them to undermine my career choices, always disguised as concern or casual conversation, but the message was always clear. What I did wasn't real work, wasn't valuable, wasn't worthy of respect. I started to dread these visits, started to feel anxious days before we were scheduled to see them. I would rehearse conversations in my head, trying to find the perfect way to explain my work that would finally make them understand, but nothing ever seemed to work. They had made up their minds about me, and no amount of explanation or evidence was going to change that. The pattern that emerged over the next few years was both predictable and soul-crushing, like watching the same painful movie on repeat, but never being able to leave the theater. Every single family event became a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults directed at my career. Thanksgiving dinners where my father-in-law would go around the table asking everyone about their jobs and accomplishments, lingering on his daughter's work as a physician and his son's position in finance, only to gloss over me with a dismissive nod and a comment about how nice it must be to have such a flexible schedule, as if flexibility was code for unemployed. Christmas gatherings where my mother-in-law would tell stories about her friends' children who were lawyers and doctors and engineers, always making sure to catch my eye as she talked about their impressive salaries and respectable careers. Birthday celebrations where relatives I barely knew would ask me what I did, and before I could fully answer, my father-in-law would interject with some joke about me being an influencer or playing on my phone all day, and everyone would laugh except me. I would stand there with a frozen smile on my face, feeling my chest tighten, wondering how something that brought me so much pride and fulfillment could be transformed into a punchline at their dinner table. The thing that made it even worse was the subtlety of it all, the way they could make me feel 2 inches tall while maintaining plausible deniability. If I ever seemed upset, they would act shocked, claiming they were just making conversation or having a bit of fun, making me feel like I was being too sensitive or couldn't take a joke. This gaslighting aspect of their behavior was perhaps the most damaging part because it made me question my own reactions, my own feelings, my own worth. I started to second-guess every emotional response I had, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was the problem. My husband would tell me I wasn't, that his parents were being unfair, but then why didn't he do more to stop it? Why did he let these conversations happen over and over again? I knew he loved me, knew he valued what I did, but his silence in these moments felt like a betrayal all its own. I remember one particular Easter dinner that stands out in my memory like a scar that never quite healed. We were all sitting in their backyard, this beautiful setup with white tablecloths and fresh flowers, the smell of ham and spring blooming in the air. Everything looked perfect, like a scene from a lifestyle magazine, but I was sitting there feeling completely invisible and simultaneously hypervisible in all the wrong ways. My sister-in-law was talking about a difficult case she had handled at the hospital, and everyone was hanging on her every word, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine admiration for her work. Then the conversation turned to me, and my mother-in-law asked, in this tone that dripped with false sweetness, if I was still doing my little internet thing, or if I had started looking for something more stable. Something more stable. Those words echoed in my head like a cruel taunt. I had just landed a 6-figure contract with a major brand, had been featured in several industry publications, had built something from the ground up that was actually thriving in a competitive market, and she reduced it all to a little internet thing. I tried to explain, tried to share my recent success, but I could see the disinterest in their faces, the way they were already mentally checking out of the conversation. My father-in-law actually looked at his watch while I was talking, and my mother-in-law interrupted me to ask if anyone wanted more dessert. That night, I cried in the car for 20 minutes before we even left their driveway. And my husband just sat there holding my hand, apologizing but offering no real solution, no real defense. These moments accumulated over time, each one adding another layer to this growing resentment and hurt that I was carrying around inside me like a weight I couldn't put down. I started to notice how their behavior was affecting other aspects of my life. I became defensive about my career when talking to anyone, always feeling the need to justify and explain and prove that what I did mattered. I found myself working longer hours, pushing harder, trying to achieve more, as if enough success would finally make them respect me. But it was never enough, was it? Because the problem wasn't my level of success or the legitimacy of my career. The problem was their narrow definition of what constituted valuable work, and their unwillingness to expand that definition to include what I did. What I actually do, what my career really entails, is something I'm deeply passionate about, and it kills me that the people who are supposed to be my family have never taken the time to truly understand it. I'm a content creator and digital strategist, which I know sounds vague to people who aren't in this world, but let me break down what that actually means in terms of the work I do every single day. I wake up at 6 in the morning and immediately check analytics from the previous day's campaigns, looking at engagement rates, click-through percentages, conversion data, and audience demographics. I spend hours crafting content strategies that align with brand values and target audience preferences, researching trends, analyzing competitor approaches, and identifying opportunities for innovation. I write copy that needs to be compelling enough to stop someone mid-scroll, creative enough to be memorable, and strategic enough to drive actual business results. I manage client relationships, which means I'm constantly communicating with business owners and marketing directors, presenting ideas, explaining strategies, and demonstrating ROI. I negotiate contracts, manage budgets that sometimes exceed what many people make in a year, and oversee campaigns that reach millions of people. I've taught myself video editing, graphic design, SEO optimization, social media algorithms, email marketing strategies, and data analysis. I've built a business from absolutely nothing, starting with a laptop and a dream, and turned it into something that not only supports me financially but also makes a real difference for the brands I work with. I've helped small businesses triple their revenue. I've created campaigns that have gone viral and changed public perception of products. I've mentored other aspiring content creators and watched them succeed. This isn't playing around on the internet. This is running a legitimate business in an industry that's revolutionizing how companies communicate with consumers. But more than just the technical aspects of what I do, this career represents something deeply personal to me. It represents freedom and creativity and the ability to shape my own destiny. I didn't want to climb someone else's corporate ladder or fit into someone else's definition of success. I wanted to build something that was mine, something that reflected my values and my vision and my unique skills. I wanted to wake up every morning excited about the work I was going to do, not dreading another day in a job that made me feel dead inside. I've had those jobs before, the ones that looked impressive on paper but made me feel like I was slowly losing myself, and I chose a different path. That choice required courage and sacrifice and an incredible amount of hard work. I've worked 16-hour days. I've dealt with difficult clients and failed campaigns and moments of crippling self-doubt. I've invested my own money, taken risks that kept me up at night, and pushed through obstacles that would have made many people quit. And I've succeeded. Not just survived, but actually thrived. Yet none of that seemed to matter to my in-laws because it didn't fit their traditional mold of what a career should look like. They couldn't see past their own limited worldview to recognize that the economy has changed, that career paths have evolved, that success can look different than it did 30 years ago. To them, if you're not sitting in an office from 9 to 5 with a title that they recognize and understand, then you're not really working. Never mind that I probably work more hours than they ever did in their corporate jobs. Never mind that I've built something sustainable and profitable and fulfilling. Never mind that their son is proud of me and that I'm happy. None of that mattered because I didn't meet their arbitrary standards of what constituted a real career. The irony is that they benefit from the industry I work in every single day. They scroll through social media, they click on ads, they make purchase decisions based on content that people like me create, but somehow they can't connect those dots to see the value in what I do. It's like they think all of that content just magically appears on the internet without any thought or strategy or work behind it. The toll this constant belittling took on my marriage was something I didn't fully recognize until I started feeling the weight of it affecting every aspect of our relationship, creating cracks in a foundation I thought was solid. My husband and I had always been partners, supporting each other's dreams and celebrating each other's successes, but his parents' behavior created this wedge between us that grew wider with each passing family gathering. The drive home after visiting them became a recurring nightmare where the same arguments would play out over and over again. I would be upset, hurt, sometimes crying, and he would be defensive, apologetic, caught between his loyalty to his parents and his love for me. He would say things like, "They don't mean it that way," or "They're just from a different generation," or "You're being too sensitive." And each one of those statements felt like another small betrayal, another indication that he was choosing their comfort over my dignity. I know he didn't mean it that way. I know he was struggling with his own conflict, but in those moments, it felt like I was fighting this battle completely alone. The resentment started to build up like sediment in a river, slowly but surely changing the landscape of our relationship. I found myself pulling away from him emotionally, building walls to protect myself from the hurt that came with his family. I stopped sharing my career victories with him because I knew they would just become another source of tension when we had to face his parents. I stopped looking forward to weekends because they often meant family obligations that I dreaded. I started to feel like I had to choose between being true to myself and keeping the peace in my marriage, and that's a choice nobody should have to make. There were nights when we would lie in bed, backs to each other, the silence between us heavy with all the things we weren't saying, all the issues we were avoiding. I would think about how much I loved him, how much I wanted our marriage to work, but I would also think about how long I could continue to sacrifice my self-respect for the sake of family harmony. The thing is, he wasn't a bad husband. He wasn't cruel or intentionally hurtful. He was just conflict-averse, especially when it came to his parents. And he genuinely believed that if we just kept the peace, if we just gave it time, things would eventually get better. But things weren't getting better. They were getting worse. Every family event left me feeling more diminished, more exhausted, more resentful. I started to fantasize about what our lives would be like if we just cut contact with his parents, if we just set that boundary and protected our peace. But I knew that wasn't fair to him, knew that family relationships are complicated, and that asking him to choose between his parents and me would only create more problems. So instead, I tried to find middle ground, tried to limit our exposure to them, tried to prepare myself emotionally before each visit. But no amount of preparation could really shield me from the cumulative effect of their dismissiveness. I remember one night after a particularly brutal family dinner, we had a fight that almost broke us. He had just finished defending his parents again, telling me I was overreacting to his mother's comment about my career being a phase, and something inside me snapped. I yelled at him, really yelled, which I almost never do, and I told him that his silence was making him complicit in their behavior, that by not standing up for me, he was essentially agreeing with them. I told him that I felt alone in our marriage, that I felt like his love for me came with conditions and compromises that I shouldn't have to make. I told him that I was starting to question whether I wanted to spend the rest of my life feeling like I wasn't good enough for his family and wondering if he secretly agreed with them. The look on his face broke my heart because I could see the pain there, could see that he was struggling too. But the damage was already done. We stayed up all night talking, really talking for the first time in months about how his parents' behavior was affecting us. He admitted that he knew his parents were wrong, that he was proud of me and what I had built, but that he didn't know how to confront them without causing a family rift. He was scared of losing his relationship with his parents, scared of being the one to cause drama, scared of facing their disappointment. I understood his fear. I really did. But I also knew that something had to change because I couldn't keep living like this. We agreed that night that he would start speaking up more, that he would try to set some boundaries with his parents. And for a while, things did improve slightly. He would change the subject when they started in on my career, or he would gently correct them when they made dismissive comments. But it wasn't enough. It was still too little, too passive, too concerned with not rocking the boat. What I needed was for him to stand up and clearly, unequivocally tell his parents that their behavior was unacceptable and had to stop. What I got was small attempts at deflection that his parents could easily ignore. The attempts I made to win their approval, to prove my worth to them, now feel embarrassing in retrospect, like watching someone try desperately to get attention from people who have already decided not to give it. I became almost obsessive about trying to demonstrate the legitimacy of my career, bringing up impressive clients I had worked with, mentioning awards I had received, casually dropping information about significant contracts I had landed. I thought if I could just make them see how successful I actually was, if I could just speak their language of prestige and profit, they would finally respect what I did. I remember printing out articles that had featured my work and leaving them strategically around when they visited, hoping they would read them and understand. I invited them to events where I was speaking on panels about digital marketing, thinking that seeing me in that context, being recognized as an expert in my field, would change their perception. They never came. Always had some excuse about being busy, or not feeling well, or having other commitments. My mother-in-law once told me that she didn't really understand what those events were about anyway, so there wouldn't be much point in her attending. That particular rejection stung more than I wanted to admit, because it felt like she wasn't even willing to try to understand my world. I tried changing my approach, thinking maybe if I showed interest in their careers and passions, they would reciprocate. I asked my father-in-law about his golf game, remembered details about his business dealings even though he had been retired for years, complimented my mother-in-law on her volunteer work and her garden. I thought building rapport in other areas would somehow translate into them respecting me professionally. It didn't. They were happy to talk about themselves, happy to receive my attention and interest, but it never flowed back in my direction. The reciprocity I was hoping for never materialized. I even went so far as to consider changing my career path, and I'm ashamed to admit that now because it shows just how deeply their disapproval had gotten under my skin. I looked into graduate programs, researched traditional corporate positions, entertained the idea of getting certified in something they might consider more legitimate. I had actual conversations with my husband about whether I should pivot my career to make his parents happy, and the fact that we were even discussing that shows how warped the situation had become. Thankfully, I came to my senses before making any drastic decisions, but the fact that I had even considered sacrificing my passion and my successful business for their approval still makes me angry at myself. I also tried the opposite approach, trying to avoid the topic of my career altogether during family gatherings, redirecting conversations away from work, focusing on other aspects of my life. I thought maybe if we just didn't talk about it, the tension would dissipate. But that strategy backfired because my silence seemed to confirm their belief that my career wasn't worth discussing, that it wasn't important enough to be part of family conversation. Plus, avoiding the topic felt like I was ashamed of what I did, like I was conceding that they were right about my career being less legitimate than everyone else's. Neither approach worked because the fundamental problem wasn't my behavior or my communication style or my level of success. The problem was their rigid mindset and their refusal to acknowledge any career path outside their narrow definition of acceptable work. I could have won a Nobel Prize in digital marketing, if such a thing existed, and they still would have found a way to diminish it because it didn't align with their traditional values. The exhaustion of constantly trying to prove myself to people who had no interest in being convinced took a serious toll on my mental health. I developed anxiety around family gatherings, would feel physically sick before we had to visit them, would lose sleep worrying about what comments they might make this time. I started to internalize their criticism, began to question whether what I did really mattered, whether I should have chosen a different path, whether I was fooling myself about my success. This self-doubt was particularly insidious because it crept into my actual work, making me second-guess decisions I would have made confidently before, making me feel like an imposter in my own career. The internal struggle I experienced during those years was like carrying on a constant battle inside my own head, a war between my rational mind that knew my worth and my emotional heart that desperately wanted acceptance from my husband's family. Every interaction with them would trigger this cascade of negative thoughts that I would spend days trying to untangle. I would replay conversations obsessively, analyzing every word, every facial expression, trying to figure out if I had somehow invited their criticism, if there was something I could have said or done differently that would have earned their respect. The rational part of my brain knew this was futile, knew that their behavior was about them and not about me, but the emotional part couldn't stop trying to solve the puzzle of how to make them like me. I started to have these intrusive thoughts at random moments throughout my day, moments when I should have been focusing on work or enjoying time with friends, but instead I was mentally rehearsing conversations with my in-laws that would never actually happen. I would imagine finally saying the perfect thing that would make them understand, finally demonstrating my value in a way they couldn't ignore, finally winning an argument I had never really been having with anyone but myself. These fantasy confrontations would play out in my mind like scenes from a movie, and I would feel this temporary sense of satisfaction, only to crash back down into reality where nothing had actually changed. The frustration was compounded by the fact that I'm generally a confident person, someone who knows her worth and doesn't typically seek validation from others. Yet here I was, completely unraveled by the disapproval of two people who honestly didn't even understand what I did for a living. It felt like I was betraying myself, betraying the strong, independent woman I had worked so hard to become, all because I couldn't handle the rejection from my in-laws. I would look at myself in the mirror some mornings and barely recognize the person staring back at me, someone who looked tired and defeated and so much smaller than I used to feel. The impact on my self-esteem was profound and far-reaching. I started to notice that I was apologizing for things that didn't require apologies, qualifying my accomplishments with phrases like, "It's not a big deal," or "I just got lucky," downplaying my success in conversations with others because I had internalized the message that what I did wasn't impressive or important. I would meet new people at parties or networking events, and when they asked what I did, I would feel this wave of anxiety, bracing myself for the judgment or dismissiveness that I had come to expect. Even when people were genuinely interested and impressed by my work, I would have trouble accepting their compliments, would assume they were just being polite, would deflect and change the subject because it felt safer than allowing myself to be proud. My friends started to notice the change in me, would comment that I seemed different, more withdrawn, less confident. One of my closest friends actually confronted me about it, told me she was worried about how I was letting my in-laws affect me, and hearing it from an outside perspective was both validating and devastating. She reminded me of who I had been before I met my husband's family, how passionate and self-assured I used to be about my career, and the contrast made me realize just how much I had lost. I had given these people so much power over my sense of self, had allowed their narrow-minded opinions to shake the foundation of my self-worth, and I was angry at myself for letting it happen. But anger at myself wasn't productive either. It was just another layer of negativity piling onto an already heavy load. I tried various coping mechanisms to deal with the emotional toll. I went to therapy, which helped to some extent, giving me a space to process my feelings and develop strategies for setting boundaries. My therapist helped me see that I was dealing with a pattern of emotional abuse, that the constant belittling and dismissiveness was a form of psychological harm that I needed to take seriously. Hearing those words, emotional abuse, was shocking at first because I had never framed it that way in my mind, but once I started looking at it through that lens, so many things made sense. I also tried journaling, meditation, exercise, anything to help manage the anxiety and resentment that had become constant companions. Some days were better than others. Some days I felt strong enough to brush off their comments and maintain my boundaries, but other days I felt completely overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The final straw, the incident that pushed me past my breaking point, happened on what should have been one of the happiest nights of the year. It was my birthday dinner, and foolishly, I had agreed to celebrate it at my in-laws' house because my mother-in-law had insisted on hosting, saying she wanted to do something special for me. I should have known better, should have trusted my instincts that were screaming at me to suggest a restaurant or literally anywhere else. But I was trying to be gracious, trying to show that I appreciated her effort. My husband and I arrived with wine and flowers, and the house was decorated nicely, with candles and a beautiful table setting that must have taken her hours to prepare. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful, thinking maybe this was a turning point. Maybe she was finally making an effort to show that she cared about me. We sat down to dinner, and the conversation was surprisingly pleasant at first. Talk about the food and the weather and some neighborhood gossip that I didn't really care about but listened to politely. Then my father-in-law asked me how work was going, and I made the mistake of sharing some genuinely exciting news. I had just been approached by a major international brand to develop their entire digital strategy for a product launch, a contract that was worth more money than I had ever made on a single project and would put my business on a completely different level. I was so proud of this achievement, so excited about the opportunity, and I thought surely this was impressive enough that even they would have to acknowledge it. I explained the project, trying to make it sound as legitimate and business-oriented as possible, using terms like strategic development and market analysis and ROI projections. I watched their faces as I spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or approval, and for a second I thought I saw my mother-in-law nod with interest. But then my father-in-law, this man who had made his career in commercial real estate and thought that made him an expert on all things business, leaned back in his chair with that infuriatingly patronizing smile and said something that I will never forget as long as I live. He said, and I quote, "Well, that's cute that they're giving you all that responsibility for your little hobby. But don't you think it's time to start thinking about a real career? You're not getting any younger, and if you and my son are planning to have children, you're going to need actual stability and benefits, not this internet playground stuff." The table went completely silent. I felt like I had been slapped across the face, felt this hot surge of adrenaline flooding my system. This was my birthday dinner, a night that was supposed to be about celebrating me, and he had just reduced the biggest professional achievement of my life to a hobby, to something cute, to internet playground stuff. And he did it so casually, so confidently, like he was giving me fatherly advice rather than insulting everything I had worked for. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to defend me, waiting for my husband to speak up, waiting for literally anyone to acknowledge how completely inappropriate that comment was. My mother-in-law just took a sip of her wine, avoiding eye contact. My sister-in-law looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And my husband just sat there with his jaw clenched, clearly angry but frozen, unable or unwilling to confront his father. That silence, that collective decision to let his words hang in the air unchallenged, was somehow worse than the insult itself. It meant they all agreed with him, or at least they weren't bothered enough by his disrespect to say anything. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, felt my hands beginning to shake, and I knew I had a choice to make in that moment. I could do what I had done 100 times before, swallow my hurt, change the subject, pretend like nothing had happened, preserve the peace at the cost of my dignity, or I could finally say what I had been holding back for 5 years. Have you ever experienced something similar with your in-laws or family members? How they dismiss something you care deeply about? I'd love to hear your story in the comments because I think so many of us suffer in silence with these kinds of family dynamics. But back to that moment, sitting at that dinner table, I could feel something shifting inside me, some internal dam that had been holding back years of anger and hurt finally starting to crack. The confrontation that followed was not planned, was not rehearsed, was not the calm and collected speech I had imagined in my fantasies. It was raw and emotional and probably not as articulate as I wish it had been, but it was real and it was necessary, and it was mine. I put down my fork with a deliberate motion that made everyone look at me, and I took a deep breath that felt like I was preparing to jump off a cliff. My voice, when I started speaking, was shaking but determined, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was worried everyone else could hear it. I looked directly at my father-in-law and I said, "No, I don't think it's time to get a real career because I already have one, and I'm not going to sit here on my birthday, in what's supposed to be a celebration, and let you diminish it anymore." The shock on his face was almost comical, like he couldn't believe I had actually responded, like he had expected me to just take it the way I always had. But I wasn't done, not even close. 5 years of suppressed feelings came pouring out of me like water breaking through a dam. I told him that what I do is not a hobby. It's a legitimate business that I built from nothing through hard work, skill, and determination. I told him that I make more money than many people in traditional careers, that I have financial stability and benefits that I provide for myself, that I don't need his or anyone else's validation to know that my work has value. I told him that the digital economy is real, that content strategy is a crucial business function that companies pay premium prices for, and that his inability to understand that doesn't make it any less legitimate. I told him that every time he and my mother-in-law have dismissed my career over the years, they've been dismissing me, my intelligence, my capabilities, and my worth as a person. I told them that I have sat through countless family dinners biting my tongue while they praised everyone else's careers, but treated mine like it was a phase I would grow out of, and I was done pretending that was okay. My mother-in-law tried to interrupt, tried to claim that I was overreacting, that it was just a joke, but I didn't let her finish. I turned to her and said that calling something a joke doesn't make it hurt less. That intention doesn't erase impact, and that they had been hurting me for years whether they wanted to admit it or not. I told her that I had tried to win their approval, had bent over backwards trying to prove myself to them, but I realized I didn't need their approval because I had my own. I told them both that I deserved respect, that my career deserved respect, and that if they couldn't offer that respect, then we were going to have to seriously reconsider how much time we spent together as a family. Then I turned to my husband, and this was maybe the hardest part of all, and I said, "And you need to decide right now whether you're going to keep sitting in silence while your parents treat me this way, because I can't do this anymore. I need you to have my back, not just in private when we're driving home and you're apologizing, but here, now, in the moment when it matters." The look on his face told me that he understood what was at stake, understood that this was a turning point, not just with his parents, but in our marriage. For a long moment, nobody spoke, and I could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, could hear my own breathing, could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on all of us. Then my husband stood up, and for a second I wasn't sure what he was going to do. Wasn't sure if he was going to side with his parents or with me, and I felt this terror that I had just destroyed my marriage in addition to my relationship with his family. But he looked at his father and he said, clearly and firmly, "She's right. You've both been incredibly disrespectful to her and to her career, and I should have said something a long time ago. I'm proud of what she does. I'm proud of what she's built, and I won't sit here and listen to you belittle it anymore." The expression on his parents' faces shifted from shock to something that looked almost like hurt, and his mother started to protest, started to say that we were being unfair, that they had always supported us, that we were overreacting. But my husband cut her off and told her that supporting us meant respecting both of us, respecting our choices and our careers, and that they had failed to do that where I was concerned. He said that we would be leaving now, that we would be taking some space from family gatherings until they could commit to treating me with the respect I deserved. And then he took my hand, looked at me with this mixture of apology and determination in his eyes, and we walked out of that house together. I was shaking so badly I could barely walk to the car, and as soon as we got inside, I started crying. Not sad tears, but this complicated mix of relief and fear and pride and exhaustion. We sat in their driveway for 20 minutes, neither of us quite ready to drive, both of us processing what had just happened. My husband kept apologizing, saying he should have done that years ago, that he was sorry for all the times he had let me face their dismissiveness alone, and I could hear the genuine regret in his voice. The aftermath of that confrontation was messy and complicated and not nearly as satisfying as I had sometimes imagined it would be. But it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. We didn't speak to his parents for almost 3 months after that dinner, and those months were filled with a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief at not having to endure their passive-aggressive comments, at not having to brace myself before every family gathering, at finally having spoken my truth after years of silence. But there was also guilt, this nagging feeling that maybe I had overreacted, maybe I had damaged something irreparable, maybe I should have handled it differently. My husband assured me repeatedly that I hadn't overreacted, that my response was completely justified, but I still struggled with it because confrontation doesn't come naturally to me, and because family relationships are so complicated. During those 3 months, my husband had several difficult conversations with his parents, conversations that he had over the phone while I listened from the other room, hearing him set boundaries and expectations in a way he had never done before. He told them that their behavior had been unacceptable, that it had damaged not only their relationship with me, but also his relationship with them, that things needed to fundamentally change if we were going to move forward as a family. I could hear the tension in these conversations, could hear his mother crying at one point, could hear his father getting defensive and angry, but my husband held firm in a way that made me fall in love with him all over again. It wasn't easy for him to stand up to his parents like that. I knew it went against every instinct he had to avoid family conflict, but he did it anyway because our marriage was more important to him than keeping the peace at any cost. Eventually, his parents reached out and asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. Just the 4 of us. No extended family or distractions. I was nervous about that meeting, wasn't sure what to expect, didn't know if they were going to try to defend their behavior or if they were genuinely ready to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our homes, and the conversation that followed was awkward and emotional, but ultimately necessary. My father-in-law started by saying that they had been doing some thinking about what I had said, that they had talked to some friends and even done some research about digital marketing and content creation, and that they were starting to understand that they had been wrong in their assessment of my career. He didn't quite apologize at first, didn't take full responsibility, but he acknowledged that their comments had been hurtful and that they hadn't really made an effort to understand what I did. My mother-in-law was more emotional, said that she never meant to make me feel bad, that she just worried about stability and security the way all parents worry about their children's futures, and that she realized she had been expressing that worry in completely the wrong way. She said that she was proud of me, which was something I had never heard from her before, and even though I could tell it was hard for her to say, I appreciated the effort. We talked for hours that day, really talked in a way we never had before, laying everything out on the table without the usual polite deflections and topic changes. I explained in detail what my work actually involved, showed them my portfolio and some of the campaigns I had created, and for the first time, they actually listened. They asked questions, real questions that showed genuine interest rather than the perfunctory ones they had asked before, and I could see them starting to understand that what I did was complex and strategic and valuable. It wasn't a magical transformation where everything was suddenly perfect. They still had their biases and their traditional views, but they were at least making an effort to see things from my perspective. We agreed to move forward with some clear boundaries in place, that they would make an effort to respect my career, and that if they ever made dismissive comments again, we would call it out immediately rather than letting it fester. The first few family gatherings after that were admittedly awkward, everyone tiptoeing around each other, being overly polite in a way that felt forced. But gradually things started to normalize into a new version of normal that was actually healthier than before. My father-in-law started asking about my projects with genuine curiosity. My mother-in-law stopped making comparison comments about other people's careers, and while I wouldn't say we became best friends, we reached a place of mutual respect that felt sustainable. The biggest change, though, was in my relationship with my husband, because we had gone through this fire together and come out stronger on the other side. He proved to me that he would choose our marriage over his parents' comfort, that he would stand up for me even when it was hard, and that gave me a security in our relationship that I hadn't fully had before. We learned how to communicate better, how to address conflicts before they reached a breaking point, how to be a united front when dealing with external pressures. Looking back on the whole experience now, several years later, I realized that while it was painful and difficult, it was also necessary for my growth and for the health of my marriage. I learned that you can't sacrifice your self-respect for the sake of keeping peace. That silence in the face of disrespect is not the same as maturity. That speaking your truth is worth the temporary discomfort it might cause. I learned that the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries and your worth, and if they don't, then you have to be willing to distance yourself from them regardless of what family title they hold. I learned that my husband's support needed to be active and visible, not just private and apologetic, and that asking for that kind of support wasn't selfish or demanding, it was necessary. Most importantly, I learned that my career, my passion, my life's work doesn't need anyone else's validation to be legitimate and valuable. I know what I've built. I know the impact I've made. I know the skills and intelligence and dedication it requires, and that knowledge is enough. I wish I had learned these lessons earlier. Wish I hadn't spent 5 years absorbing negativity and letting it affect my self-worth. But I also recognize that sometimes we need to go through difficult experiences to fully understand our own strength and to clarify our values and boundaries. If you're going through something similar right now, if you have in-laws or family members or anyone in your life who consistently dismisses or belittles your career or your passions, I want you to know that you don't have to accept that treatment. You deserve respect. You deserve to be proud of what you do. And you deserve to have people in your life who celebrate your successes rather than diminish them. It's scary to speak up. I know that better than anyone, but I promise you that the liberation you feel when you finally stand up for yourself is worth the temporary discomfort of the confrontation. Your career, whatever it is, whatever path you've chosen, has value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't spend years trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided not to see your worth. Don't sacrifice your mental health and self-respect for the illusion of family harmony. Set your boundaries, demand the respect you deserve, and be willing to enforce consequences if those boundaries are crossed. It won't always be easy. Relationships might get complicated. You might face pushback and guilt and accusations of being too sensitive, but hold firm because you are worth it. I understand the importance of content like this. Content that validates experiences and reminds people that they're not alone in their struggles. Because during those difficult years, I felt so isolated, like I was the only person dealing with this kind of family dynamic. But the truth is, so many people face similar situations. So many people are dealing with family members who don't respect their career choices or who belittle their accomplishments, and we need to talk about it. We need to share these stories, we need to support each other, we need to remind each other that we deserve better. So if this story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar, or if you're going through it right now, please leave a comment below and share your experience. Tell me how you handled it, tell me what you're struggling with, tell me what you learned. This community is here to support each other, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this video touched your heart, if it made you feel less alone or gave you the courage to stand up for yourself, please hit that like button because it helps me reach more people who need this message. Subscribe to Living Through It for more real, raw, emotional stories about navigating the complicated relationships and experiences that make us human. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, because every week I'm sharing stories that matter, stories that reflect real struggles and real triumphs. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your worth is not determined by anyone else's ability to see it. You are enough. Your career is legitimate and you deserve respect. Never forget that.